Amen. Please be seated. We are celebrating National Meat Locker Day this morning. That's why it's so cold in here. It was a joke. It wasn't worth repeating, Linda. I'm sorry. This week we are going to go through Psalms chapter 9. But before we do, I'd like to remind you of what we looked at in Psalms chapter 8 last week. Remember that we saw that God's ultimate intent for mankind is to dwell with them. Remember the psalmist, after looking at all of creation, this question comes up: what is man? What is man? Meaning, what is mankind? Who are we? And we saw that God's definition is we are co-regent. He created us to be co-regents with God over God's creation. In the micro, in the individual realm, you individually are co-regent with God over the part of creation in which He has given you responsibility and authority. And we saw how this practically applies as we looked at 3 stories. And at the conclusion of the 3 stories, all of us recognized that God actually had moved in, and He lives in the houses of those who would welcome Him. We concluded with the remembrance of the verse in Revelation 3:20 where Jesus, speaking to believers, says, "I stand at the door and knock." And so that was last week's. And so we were looking at that. What is the purpose? What is the purpose of mankind? This week in Psalms chapter 9, we're going to direct our attention to mankind as it is divided into nations, and what God's role is as judge over those nations. So just beginning in Psalms chapter 9, the first 2 verses, David says, "I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart. I will recount all of your wonderful deeds, and I will be glad and exult in you. I will sing praises to your name, O Most High." Now, it begins here with personal pronoun. He begins by saying I, and I, and I. But I would like to remind you that even as David is saying I, David is king over a nation. And so he's speaking from his position as the co-regent over the nation of Israel. And he says in here, he says, "I will exult in you." Exult's not a term that we use, so I went and looked up the official definition, and it goes something like this: to feel or to show triumph, elation, or jubilation. To feel or to show triumph, elation, or jubilation. And so the ancients always looked at this psalm as a psalm of triumph, a psalm of victory. And I want you to consider this for a moment. Victory is not something you can have without having adversity. Now, we could just stop right there. Victory is not, I want you to notice the word exalt is, it says to feel or to show triumph. They had given an example of how you at the spelling bee they always say use it in a sentence. So I'm going to use it in a sentence. Exulting in her escape, Lisa closed the door behind her. Evidently, Lisa had been tied up somewhere, and exulting in her escape, she closes the door behind her. This is a psalm like that. It is a psalm of triumph and victory, but you cannot have the victory without having the adversity. Verses 3 and 4, David says, "When my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before your presence. For you have maintained my just cause. You have sat on the throne giving righteous judgment. Now, generally when we read the Psalms, we read it from the individual point of view. We read it as though, okay, David's this guy, and David's experiencing this, and I experiencing something like that. But in this psalm, in Psalm chapter 9, although he uses the personal pronouns, do not forget, he is a king. He is ruling over a nation, and when he speaks of the enemy, he's talking about another nation with armies that had beset against his nation and their armies. And he speaks here in that environment of my army was pitted against another army. Do you know what happens when your army loses? Just watch the news in Ukraine. Men, women, and children are slaughtered. When your army loses, the town is razed. You live your life now in slavery. It's not like watching a movie on Netflix, folks. It's the real thing. David had an army, and he had armies opposing him. And he says that there is this throne that gives righteousness. He says, you have maintained my just cause. I was at war, and I was in a just war, a righteous war, and you upheld my cause. Why do I keep focusing on the nation aspect of this? Because verse 5. He says, you have rebuked the nations, you have made the wicked perish, you have blotted out their name forever and ever. He's speaking here in this Psalms of national relationships and of wars and of desperation and of consequences, winners and losers, where the stakes are high. Well, how do we end up with these various nations? Remember, last week we were looking at the ultimate intent of God is to dwell, to live with men and women, mankind. But why does he divide it into nations? And I'd like to remind you how nations came to be. First of all, it's all in the book of Genesis. We have to consider, first of all, there are 3 rebellions that take place, 3 rebellions against the Lord. The first one is in Genesis chapter 3. You all know the story. Eve takes of the fruit and she gives it to Adam, and he eats of it. This is a rebellion for this reason. God says, I've made all of the garden, and I'm God. And I'm placing you in my garden to rule my garden. And I want you to expand it to cover the whole world. You're going to populate the whole world. And you and I together, this is going to be your realm, your responsibility, and I'm giving you authority. But remember, I am always God the Creator. Well, what Adam and Eve did was, they said, I really like this idea of us having this place and us ruling over it, and wouldn't it be even better if God weren't here? And we were at the top. And so they took the fruit. They rebelled. It's a rebellion. The second rebellion is the time of Noah. In the times of Noah, we see, Nathaniel, put up Genesis 6:4. Something happens, there's different interpretations. It says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. And these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Now, there's different thoughts of who the sons of God are. For our discussion today, it doesn't matter. The point was, something happened that wasn't supposed to happen. And because of it, the world was filled with such evil that every thought of man was evil. And so God sent a flood to wash the planet clean. That's our second rebellion. he saves 8 people to start over again and to repopulate, and that brings us to our third rebellion in Genesis chapter 11. And here's where we get the story of the Tower of Babel. Once again, God tells Noah and his descendants, I want you guys to multiply and spread over the earth. But they said, let us gather together in one place, let's cooperate together, and let us use industry, and let us build a civilization that reaches to the heavens. In other words, let us build a civilization, a secular. Let us build a civilization that has no gods. And so at that point, God strikes them with languages. He confounds them, confuses them, and he scatters them across the world, and he creates nations at that moment. This is where they come from. And there's a very interesting passage of Scripture that gives us a little more insight in that in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9. It says, when the Most High, that's God, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, who divided mankind? Why did God divide mankind? In response to their third rebellion. He divided mankind. He fixed the borders of the people. Where did the people get their land from? God gave it to them. He fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. Again, there are different interpretations. Some are saying he placed kings over them, and those kings, those human kings, are sons of God. Others use the Hebrew term Nephilim and say these are actually the same as in Genesis chapter 6. These are actually fallen angels, demons, spiritual beings. It doesn't matter for our discussion today. And it says, but the Lord's portion is his people. Which nation was the Lord's? His people is Jacob, his allotted heritage. So in other words, it goes like this. At the striking of the Tower of Babel, third strike, you're out. I'm done with you. You're out. And so like a deck of cards, you go there, 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 you go there. You control them, you rule them, you rule. I'm done. You rule them. I'm just giving them to you. You rule them, demonic beings or very vile kings. And then he reaches into one of those. He said, except for over here, look, right here, you have all of these people except this one right here, Abraham. Come over here, Abraham. I want to talk to you because I'm going to have a nation too. And I'm going to make a nation out of you, and you are going to be mine, my possession. And so he makes nation. Now, all of these nations have a land. You're going to live over there. Here are your borders. That mountain, that river is going to be your borders. You've got that valley. You've got this continent. That's yours over there. Every nation except this one, his. He says to them, I'm going to give this piece of property to you, this one right here, but not yet. First, I'm going to tuck you over here into Egypt. And so Abraham's descendants, depending on whether you use the Masoretic text or if you use Dead Sea Scrolls, either 70 or 75, both are written, are tucked into Egypt. And they begin to flourish for 400 years. And they're in oppression. They have an adversary. They have problems. And while this is going on, in the land that he said that he would take care of and hold for them and bring them into, there are nations that are living there. And he lists them over and over in scriptures. You may have almost had it memorized. The Amorites, the Jebusites, the Hittites, the Perizzites. All of them are living there, right? So that's how we end up with the nations. By the time the 400 years are over, God reaches over here into Egypt with Moses, and he brings the children of Israel through various adventures and rebellions and difficulties a roundabout way for 40 years, getting rid of one generation and bringing up another. One leader is gone and another comes, and he brings them over to the east side of the Jordan. Here's the land that they're going to move into. As he's coming around the corner, they send a message to the Edomites, distant cousins, descendants of Esau. And they say, Mr. and Mrs. Edomite, we'd like to cut through your land. We're going to stay on the highway. We won't touch anything. If we drink any water, we'll pay for it. And the Edomites said, no. So they traveled a little further north. And they said to the Amorites, Mr. and Mrs. Amorite, King Amorite, we'd like to cut through your land. We'd like to go on your highway. We won't touch anything. And if our cattle, if we drink any water, we'll pay you for it. We're just trying to get over there. And the Amorites not only say no, but they bring an army out and attack them. So God is on Israel's side, and they slaughter the Amorites and move into the Amorites' land. Well, just to the north of that are the Moabites, distant cousins of the Amorites, and the Moabites go, oh my. And so they call this guy, King Moabite, Balak, calls a prophet, Balaam, and says, come and curse them. You all know what happens, right? Can't curse them. All they can do is bless them. Why? These are God's possession. These are God's possessions. So here I've got a nation that's living without a land, while all of the other nations have a land. Eventually, God brings the Israelites across the Jordan River, and starting with Jericho, they move into the land, and they begin dispossessing the people of the land, and they dispossess them violently, as they are told by God to do. And as they move in, there are still many enemies in the land, and David finally becomes king of Israel. And he has his army, and the other people there have theirs, and there is war. Is everybody with me? Very good. So David in that says in verse 5 again, you have rebuked the nations, you have made the wicked perish, you have blotted out their name forever. You have rebuked the nations, you have made the wicked perish, you have blotted out their name forever. Why? He's blotting out their name. But in all of those nations, his name had been blotted out. They all worshipped and served gods who were not gods. They all worshipped and served vile, malevolent beings. They offered their children in fiery sacrifice to these demonic creatures that are behind these wooden and stone idols. And so God brings Israel in like he had brought a flood in the old world to wipe the sin out. He brings Israel in like a flood, and he takes out the people of the land there. And he says, now this is your inheritance. Would you look at verse 7 and 8 of Psalms 9? Six, 7, and 8. The enemy came to an end in everlasting ruins. Their cities you rooted out. The very memory of them has perished. That's verse 6. You know, it's not appropriate to tell jokes about the Irish. It's politically incorrect. You know that, right? And there's other nations. It's political. You're saying it's okay? John said, John, have you got an Irish joke you want to share with us? No? Okay. It's not right to tell jokes about Polish people. It's not right to tell jokes about the British people. But can I tell you this? If you want to tell a Hittite joke, you can. Do you know why? There ain't no Hittite. Look at verse 6. The enemy came to an end in everlasting ruins. Their cities you rooted out, the very memory of them has perished. This was God's move. Verse 7 and 8. But the Lord, but Yahweh, sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne for justice, and he judges the world with righteousness. He judges the people with uprightness. We generally see the throne of God as a place of government. Generally, when we think about thrones, we think about a king sitting on the throne. We think about it as a place of government. Here's where the decisions are made for the nations. Here's where the proclamations come out. Here's where the seat of government. It's the place where things get done. It's a place of authority. But in this case, this throne that he's sitting on is not the seat of government. This throne is above the thrones of government. This is a throne of judgment upon the thrones of government. See, he's talking about these different nations, and he's saying, this one is gone. This one's out. Why? Look at what their kings have done. Look at what their priests have done. He is proclaiming judgment upon the thrones. This is a throne of judgment above the thrones of government. Does everybody get that? And this throne, this is the seat of judgment of those who sit on the seats of government. Did you know that there is a throne that judges the President of the United States of America? There is a throne that judges the President of Russia, Putin. There is a throne above the President or the Premier, whatever his title is, of China. Did you know that? There is a throne above them, and he judges them for how they govern. That's what this psalm is about. The nations rage, the kings plot, everybody is rebelling, but there is a throne. Everything is judged from that throne, and everyone. David is expressing this great jubilation. He's exulting because there are nations around him that have risen up, and God had told David, I want you to take that land. He has a just cause, a righteous cause. And God upholds his cause and gives him victory. And so he triumphs. Verses 7 and 8, but the Lord sits enthroned forever, and he has established his throne of justice. I love it. And he judges the world with righteousness. He judges the people with uprightness. Verse 9 and 10. The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed. A stronghold in times of trouble. Now look, and those who know your name put their trust in you. For you, O Yahweh, have not forsaken those who seek you. See, you might go, okay, he divided the nations up. He sends them out there and he places these false gods over them. Okay, so if you did it, if you sent them out there and you placed these false gods over them, then why do you get upset that they forgot your name? Why do you get upset that they're worshiping these gods? So I just want to remind you of two stories. Turn in your Bible, please. Keep your finger in Psalms. Turn in your Bibles to Joshua chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2. In Joshua chapter 2, the story begins. Spies are sent into Jericho to look it over. The king of Jericho wants to kill these spies, wants to capture them. A prostitute named Rahab hides them in some straw on her roof. We pick up the story there in verse 8 of Joshua chapter 2. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, look, watch this. She said to the men, I know that, Lord, capital letters or small letters? Here's what she said. I know that Yahweh has given you the land. How does she know his name? And that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For Yahweh your God, He is the God in heaven above and on the earth beneath. And now then, please swear to me by Yahweh that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house. And give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and my mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver them from death. And the men said to her, our life for yours, even to death, if you do not tell the business of ours. Then when Yahweh gives us the land, we will deal kindly with you. That's the first story. The second story is in Genesis. Nathaniel, find Genesis 14, 18 through 20. It says, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, bought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, blessed be Abraham by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. You remember the story? Abraham has to go to war with a just cause against 5 kings who have taken his nephew Lot. And he goes to war and he's given a victory. And when he comes back, here's this figure, this fellow named Melchizedek. I'm giving you 2 stories here. Now, where is Melchizedek king of? Salem, which means peace. Do you know the city that he was actually king of was Jerusalem, before the children of Israel ever moved in? Now consider this for a moment. Remember that in Genesis chapter, I think it's 15. Do I have that one, Nathaniel? Yeah, Genesis chapter 15, verses 15 and 16, when God's promising Abraham, your people are going to go into Egypt, and when I bring them out, I'm going to give them this land. Look at what he says. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation. For the iniquities of the Amorites, the sins of the Amorites, is not yet complete. Those were the people who were living right around Salem. What I'm trying to tell you is this. Right in the middle of those nations that God had dealt out, he sets a priest and king of the God Most High named Melchizedek. And by the time 400 years later, when they come into the land, this prostitute knows the name of Yahweh. And she cries out to them, and she puts her trust, she switches sides. The prostitute says, would you remember me when you come in? Will you save me and my family? And they say yes. The point that I'm making is this. No matter where you were born, no matter what nation you were born into, no matter what time you were born into that nation, no matter who the governor is, no matter what religion is in that nation, whether it is Muslim or whether it is Hindu or whether it is Catholic, whatever it is, there is always a witness to God Almighty. And there is always grace and mercy at His throne of judgment. In fact, if I could just consider this for a moment with me. We're talking about a physical nation of Israel, and we're talking about physical nations. But now in this age that you and I live, the Bible tells us that He is drawing people from all of those physical nations, all of the time periods. He's drawing people, and He is creating a holy nation, a royal priesthood, a nation of believers out of all languages. He's creating that nation. Here's what I love about this. Can I tell you who makes up that nation? Every person that's in the nation of God is a Rahab. Every one of us. She's a prostitute living in a condemned nation, a sinner living in a condemned nation. But she has enough sense that when she hears the word of God, she's able to say, that's God and I'm in trouble. And she's able to say, will you please forgive me and save me? There is no excuse. It is a nation, a spiritual nation made up of Rahabs from every language, And every time period, you're a Rahab, I'm a Rahab. We're all just Rahabs. Now here's what's beautiful. This king who wrote this psalm, his great-great-grandmother was Rahab. He's descended from Rahab. And yet, he is in the nation of God. And he is in a just war because God is shaking thrones and moving them around. There's always a witness. In Acts chapter 17, look at what it says. Acts 17, verse 24. Then God, who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath. How much of mankind does he give life and breath to? All mankind and everything. And he made from one man every nation. Who made the nations? God made the nations. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live in all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling places. You live there. You guys are going to live there. This language over here, that language over there. Why? That they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward Him and find Him. Yet He's not actually far off from each one of us. Because in Him we live and move and have our being. What I'm trying to say to you is this. Last week we saw the ultimate intent of God is to dwell, to tabernacle, to live with you in your house. That's creation. But another aspect of creation as a result of sin is He makes nations. And those nations are scattered throughout the world. And His throne is above the throne of every one of those nations. And as He brings judgment, and as wars are taking place in the macro, as we see the things happening and the bombs dropping, and we see the horror of it in the micro, for every one of them, there is a witness to who He is. And there is an invitation. And there is mercy and grace at the throne of God. My heart breaks as I see what is taking place in Ukraine. And I pray that tanks run out of gas. I pray that weapons jam. I pray that little boys walking in a column of refugees crying will find their mother. But ultimately, I know that God is over it all. I know that God sees everything that every soldier does. And I know that God's arms are open wide. And any who seek refuge in Him, not in NATO, not in Poland, any who seek refuge in Him will find refuge in Him. And no one will be turned away, whether Russian or Ukrainian or American. Verse 9 and 10, again, of Psalms 9, the Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. And those who know your name put their trust in you, for you, O Yahweh, have not forsaken those who seek you. Verse 11 and 12, David continues, sing praises to the Lord who sits enthroned in Zion. Tell among the people His deeds, for He who avenges blood is mindful of them. He does not forget the cry of the afflicted. I would like you to notice that there's a theme in this psalm over and over and over about whether or not God is remembered or forgotten, and whether or not the nations are remembered or forgotten. And it goes like this. If you as a nation do what Adam and Eve did and decide, you know what, I think we're going to be secular. You know what that means, right? Without God. I think we'll run our nation as though there is no God, because after all, you can't tell for sure. Nobody knows. And which God is it after all? I think we'll be secular. And if the nation forgets God, the one enthroned will judge them, and that nation will be forgotten by God. Do you understand? Now, does that mean that we're not supposed to have a secular government? Oh, no, it's fine if we have a secular government. What matters is, do the people who live here remember Him? Do the citizenry remember Him? Let me just put it in crass terms that I know is politically incorrect. Do the folks go to church on Sunday morning? Do the folks acknowledge Him as their protector? Do they cry to Him first when the towers come down? Do the folks acknowledge Him and give Him thanks and say, you are the one, from you emanates freedom. You are the one who has placed us in this land of bounty. You are the one that hemmed us in with oceans to either side. You are the one that protects us. Or do they forget and say, look at our army, look at our economy, look at our commercial center, look at our universities, look at our Tower of Babel. They seem so strong. But there is one sitting on a throne higher than our towers. He laughs at us. And He just knocks them down and says, now what will save you? There is a theme here. As the nations have been divvied out, there is a constant witness, a constant testimony. Romans chapter 1, verse 20 and 21. You can see it up here. It says, for His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Look at verse 15 of Psalms 9. The nations have sunk in the pit that they have made. In the net that they hid, their own foot has been caught. The Lord has made Himself known. He has executed judgment, and the wicked are snared in the work of their own hands. Oh God, help us to not forget Him in the United States. Oh God, help us. If we as a nation forget God, God will make our nation not even a memory. Now you'll notice I skipped 2 verses. Verses 13 and 14. Look at those. Be gracious to me, O Lord. Do you see the exclamation point? See my affliction from those who hate me. O you who lift me up from the gates of death, that I may recount all your praises, that in the gates of the daughter of Zion I may rejoice in your salvation. I want you to notice something here. David is king of a nation that is not forgetting God. David is a king of God's nation. And under affliction and under difficulty, being oppressed from the surrounding nations, he confesses, you are the one who lifts me up. You're the one who saves me, not my army. Do you all understand why it was such a horrendous sin for David to do the census and count everybody in Israel of military age? Do you understand what he was doing? For a moment, he was forgetting that God is the one who gives victory, and he was counting his guns. I praise God that God corrected him so quickly so that he didn't have a chance to continue on that path that we tend to be on all too frequently. Verse 17, the wicked shall return to Sheol, all the nations that forget God. Do you see it there again? For the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish forever. Remember, I told you that he is judging the nations. Do you know one of the things that he judges is how do they treat the afflicted? Do we add to their burden? How do we treat the second class? Do we make their life easier? Do we make their life harder? Do we take advantage of them? You know that our nation lived with a rule of slavery for many years. Did we take advantage of them? Yes. God doesn't forget. We paid a terrible price for that. The blood flowed for years. American blood flowed for what they had done. Their wealth was destroyed because of that. What I'm trying to say is, there is a judge that is judging right now how the United States of America is governed. Are we governed by the Ten Commandments? Or are we governed by pragmatism? Are we governed with mercy and compassion and strength? He doesn't forget. And if we don't get it right, we will be among the forgotten. Verse 18, the needy shall not always be forgotten. The hope of the poor shall not perish forever. And finally, verse 19 and 20, do you see an exclamation part there? Arise, O Lord, let no man prevail. He says, let the nations be judged before you. Let me just ask you, are we ready right now, as the United States of America, are we ready right now? Could we say, God, rise up and judge the world? We stand right just before you. We're ready for you to make a determination upon who we are. Not as long as the blood flows from the abortion clinics. Not as long as orphans don't have families. Not as long as widows have their houses seized by con men or the government. Not as long as we are more concerned about our next movie on Netflix than we are about whether or not somebody downtown has a pillow for their head. He does not forget one of them, and he does not forget how we deal with them. Why? I can't change the government. But I can certainly do better at loving my neighbor. There's the story that Jesus tells. We call it the Good Samaritan. And we even have Good Samaritan laws now. The word Samaritan now doesn't mean what it used to mean. If you wanted it to mean what Jesus originally meant for it to be, you would need to come into a church service and some person in church would say, you know what? I'm pretty secure. I'm pretty sure that I'm following the laws of God. And after all, we are a nation of laws. And so I think that we're all pretty just. We're pretty much doing what we're doing. And Jesus would tell this story in this sanctuary. He would say, there was this homosexual that went and emptied his bank account and went down to the border and found people who were hungry and thirsty. There was this progressive person from San Francisco. We would say, I'm sure that I'm right, that I'm just. He would say, there's this woman named Nancy Pelosi. And we'd go, what? That's the point. He's doing it as a shock value. Are you really a neighbor? Really? That's what he's asking. You see, the religious right says, well, define neighbor. And he switches it. He doesn't define neighbor. He defines you. The question isn't who's your neighbor. The question is, who are you a neighbor to? There's a judge. Nothing will be forgotten. Nothing will be forgotten. And he, whether you follow the Ten Commandments, you follow the upgraded Sermon on the Mount, he has told us how he wants us to govern. And you have an area of government where you have responsibility and you have authority. You have a throne that you sit upon. I want to make sure that when he comes, we can say, God, you upheld our just cause. We were righteous in the things that we did. You gave us the keys to your household, and while you were gone, we didn't beat the servants. We didn't deprive them of their food or of their pay. We made sure that we took care of those that you put in our way. I was asked a week or so ago from one of our young people here, when Jesus tells this story about who is my neighbor, who are we supposed to love? Is it just the people in the church? That was the question. Is he talking about, when he's talking about love your neighbor, is he talking about the people in the church? You know what the answer is? He's talking about whoever you come into contact tomorrow, whoever you come into contact with tomorrow, that you have the ability to bless. That's who he's talking about. That's who you're supposed to love. Arise, O Lord, let not man prevail, let the nations be judged before you. Well, Pastor, you're kind of preaching kind of hard here because of verse 20. Put them in fear, O Lord. Let the nations know that they are but men. We are not the final say. There is one who has the final say, and we will all face him someday. What did you hear today? God is on his throne. What else? Whoever seeks refuge in him will find it. What else did you hear? We're not ready. Has anybody memorized Hosea 10:12? Can I get somebody that has memorized Hosea 10:12 to stand right now? and be the teacher's pet. Wait, are you saying to me that we believe God gave us a verse and we didn't memorize it? Grace hasn't memorized. Are you pointing to Grace? Grace, they're all counting on you. Do you want to do it in Korean or English? Put Hosea 10:12 on the screen, please. Sow for yourself righteousness. Look, follow these phrases, okay? It's very simple. There's 4 phrases and then a conclusion. Let's let line 1 be sow for yourself righteousness. And Beverly, I know you've got this memorized. You had it memorized in January, didn't you? Oh, you forgot it. That was January. I should have called on you. Sow for yourself righteousness. Let that be phrase number 1. Sow for yourself righteousness. Right? Reap steadfast love. Let that be phrase 2. Do you see that? Sow for yourself righteousness. Reap steadfast love. Reaping always follows sowing, right? Okay. Break up your fallow ground. That's number 3. Break up your fallow ground. And then you can put all of the rest of it together. For it is the time to seek the Lord, that He may come and rain righteousness upon you. Are you getting a theme out of all of these sermons? Don't be comfortable. Break up the fallow ground. Don't keep doing business as usual. Why? Because He's almost here. The sun is peeking over the horizon. The pink sky is starting to light more and more. In an instant, He will arrive. And we're not ready, as Brandon says. Well, don't just stay like that. Would you meditate on this verse? Take this verse and apply it to your life. What else did you hear today? Okay. Don't fear the battles. Know the voice. Know that God has a voice of protection around the weak. What else? Who am I a neighbor to? What else? Time to wake up. What else? Anything else? Okay, I'm going to give you 3 I want you to go home with. Okay? I want you, remember, last week we saw the ultimate intent of God was to dwell and to live with man. And how beautiful. Wasn't that a wonderful thing that we learned, right? This week, understand the creation you live in, as well as God's intent for you, is for Him to be dwelling with you. The world that you live in, He has sorted it out into nations. You get that? And that He is judge of them. Make sure you have that piece of truth. That's number 1. He made the nations, and He's judge over the nations, and He will judge them. Number 2, He is creating a spiritual nation. He's calling people out of the nations, from every tribe and language, the Bible tells us, and He's putting them into a nation, a spiritual nation. Do you get that? That's number 2. Number 3, ready? That nation is made up entirely of Rahabs. That nation is made up entirely of Rahabs, like me. I was a Rahab. What changed? What happened? I heard the witness. And I responded by coming to the throne of grace. And exactly as Rahab said, I said, will you please save me? And I received mercy. You get that? Okay. And then for saints, those of you who are walking and living with God, remember, you cannot have victory without an adversary.